Welcome to the IAB UK Podcast.
Welcome back to the IAB UK Podcast. I'm your host, James Chandler, and this is the final episode in our special retail media miniseries produced in partnership with Tesco Media and Insight Platform. Today, we're rounding off the series with a deep dive into how agencies and their clients are already leveraging Tesco's retail media offerings and what's next on the horizon. I'm joined by Steve Edwards, Head of Agency at Tesco Media, Vicky Fox, Chief Planning Officer at OMG UK, and Andy Collins, Head of Planning at Wavemaker. Together, we'll discuss how agencies are already working with Tesco to create smart, impactful media plans, and we'll be giving you a sneak peek of what to expect at Tesco's retail media upfronts happening on Wednesday, the 22nd of October. Let's start then. What big searching question, Andy, what is retail media?
I mean, it feels like a channel that is kind of developing at pace, as a lot of our kind of industry is. We tend to sort of try and default to the kind of IAB definition.
Very sensible.
Yeah, exactly. That it's kind of digital spaces, retail spaces, and essentially the data that is owned by retailers, essentially. And I think it's important not to pigeonhole it and think about how broadly that can be kind of activated and taking it out of just a small, narrow conversion channel.
Yeah. Does it work as a kind of a category for you, Vicky, or are you thinking about it differently?
Yeah, it's hard to be too reductive. You don't want to be too reductive, do you, with a new channel? So I guess if you think about it in a more expansive way, it's new data to drive insight, which is great. It's new planning and new channels. The opportunities to unlock new audiences and drive growth. And then it's the opportunity to measure all those outcomes really effectively. So that, I guess that's what it offers us in terms of a new opportunity. And
we should give you the right of reply as well. I mean,
get this wrong.
It's the sort of the basic question, but how do you articulate it, I guess?
Yeah, I remember having a few of these conversations with ISBAR and IAB. Obviously been involved in a lot of definitions, and I think where you've got to, it makes sense, right? Really, it's about the utilisation of retailer marketplaces and retailer data to deliver very specific and sometimes non-specific outcomes in paid media. But I think that the points that both Vicky and Andy have just raised are really, really important. I think there's an argument to say that we shouldn't really treat retail media as a channel at all. It's something that actually pervades a lot of, if not all, existing kind of media channels, which probably adds to the confusion somewhat, right? I'm very conscious of that.
Yeah.
But I would tend to normally start conversations about the benefits of retail media in the insights that can be derived from shopper behaviour, which have very broad applications if you consider it, and then in the measurement space as well. I think there's a really big opportunity. So those are the two areas that I think, particularly from a planning perspective, are really important. Even
when we're counting it, so when we try and capture retail media and ad spend, it's tough. It's not like podcast, or it's not like gaming, where you can kind of wrap your arms around it. I mean, there's a bit of retail media. But when you think about something like offsite, on-site's pretty easy. When you get into like off-site, and then we're going to get into store, it becomes a lot harder. It's almost exactly like new things that come along, but on the other hand, it's kind of it's not like it at all. Andy, 15 years at Wavemaker. How's planning changed in your time?
I mean, it sounds cliched to sort of say we've never been busy or that kind of stuff, but I think that's genuinely true from a planning perspective. The media landscape is more fragmented than ever. Different audiences consuming different media. The amount of stuff that we kind of ask planners to hold in our heads. Everything, what's our kind of position on DE&I, and how are we making sure we're reaching diverse audiences? How are we layering in sustainability credentials? How are we finding unique, interesting data points to kind of power our targeting? So I think the challenge at the moment is how you tackle this sort of fragmented world. And we sort of touched on it there, the breadth, we talk about retail media as a thing, but actually the breadth that it creates is just vast, and how you cut through that complexity to try and do what we're ultimately trying to do, reach consumers in meaningful ways.
Yeah. it sort of comes back to that. How do you leverage the specialists in your business? Because you'll have some proper retail media people who know all about it. How do your kind of planning community and strategists leverage all of that expertise?
Like they do for any specialist, you create a set of planners, I guess, that are broadly T-shaped. Often planners come from having a background in a particular channel, so you create planners that are T-shaped, and then you sort of have a broad understanding of all the other channels they're not an expert in. And then you have to create the right environment of sharing, learning, developing, culture of test and learn, and connecting the right teams together. So we had a retail media day actually yesterday in Bankside.
Nice.
Where everyone was invited in, all the planners spent a day with lots of our partners to understand more about the landscape. So building those relationships, those connections, understanding what's possible with that new data that they've never really used before and what that means, and then and having the specialist there hosting the whole day to make sure that those connections are built and everyone understands kind of on what the roadmap looks like for all the different partners.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be very, very easy for you and your teams just to go in and talk to the retail media, the commerce people that have worked in shopper and trade and all those kinds of things. How do you get a bit more upstream?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is those teams are really important. They've been central to us evolving our proposition and scaling our business particularly with agency partners. So this is and will remain a really important stakeholder group for us. But if you think about Tesco's business, and other retailers are in a similar position, we're establishing data partnerships with programmatic businesses like the Trade Desk, with broadcasters like Channel 4, Sky and ITV, with social channels like Meta and Pinterest, as well as our owned and operated portfolio. It's big and it's broad. Yeah. And I think if we rely on specialists to really pull all of that together, like the stakeholder community in agencies across those areas are enormous on their own. Like, that's a real burden. Yeah. And this is why we think the planning communities and the strategy communities, if depending upon agency structures, are really important, because they should have a view across all of those different areas to help us to start to build like truly omnichannel strategies. I think it's our job, and it's the industry's job, to try and simplify, translate, and to create the right reasons to believe as we go about doing that. Yeah. What's working well from your point of view, Andy, in terms of, I guess, how you're interacting with some of those specialists? I mean, Vicky talked about Retail Media Day at OMG. They're similar things that you're working on that you can sort of transfer some of that knowledge, some of that expertise, get it a bit more upstream. Yeah, so I think we talk a lot about kind of elevating some of the conversations that traditionally sit in these potentially specialist kind of silos, to the idea that everyone is busy, the pace of work is high. We talk this idea of what's the stick in the wheel that kind of stops the planning flywheel just churning and going. Actually, some of those specialist skills that have been potentially siloed, actually let's stop the flywheel, bring those conversations upstream. Look at the insights that we can get from kind of retail media and bring that upstream. Look at the insights we can get from influencer platforms. Look at the insights we can get from some of the traditional silos and bring them into the earlier kind of planning stage, because that's when you start to uncover those kind of transformational insights that actually generate growth, which is what we're trying to deliver for our clients. Yeah, I mean that's interesting. There's the kind of the retail media bit, so using shopping data to power stuff that you might do with Tesco, but I guess there is a layer above that, which is this incredible data which is now available to use across the entire plan. Do you see it like that as well? Absolutely. I think we were like first agency group to access some of that media insight data in the platform. And what's important is, I think, creating the framework, creating the right conditions so that all of the planners know that it's there, know how to access it, know sort of where it sits in their planning process, and it'll feel very different whether you're an endemic or non-endemic brand. Yeah, good point. That's kind of key to set up front. That, but it doesn't mean it's not valuable if you have non-endemic. Understanding
understanding people is kind of why we're here. And that's an incredible data set to help us do that. So that's the first place you'd start with the data.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about this endemic, non-endemic. Endemic, kind of easy. You can, for the uninitiated, i.e. me, it's you can buy it in Tesco. Yeah. The stuff you can't buy in Tesco, autos, other things. Do you treat them slightly differently?
Yeah, we there's a couple of ways to answer this, right? So we are doing work with non-endemics. We have a brilliant partnership in place at the minute with Vauxhall and with Publicis that evolves around our charging points and enabling Vauxhall drivers to charge free of charge, but also get additional club card benefits. So they're part of our kind of broader reward program, but I would consider them to be more integrated partnerships than regular business as usual kind of business. And we're still figuring out really what our plans are in that space. However, I reckon every week my team will be involved in a conversation around how can we apply shopper behavior to a separate category. I mean, a really simple example will be how can we understand changing behaviors around whether it's anything such as it could be healthy eating, vegan trends, whatever it may well be, and how can that be applied to the health and fitness sector? That's a really, really simple one. And so I think the more that we engage with planning communities, the more we'll see these use cases emerge. Right now, our kind of bread and butter, if you like, is on making sure that our endemic partners, our grocery partners, our FMCG partners are really understanding the full breadth of our solution, and we're working cohesively with client, which is sometimes client shopper, client media, client brand, and our agency partners to really create that collaborative environment.
Unlike other new things that come along, retail media, in a sense, has this massive legacy in trade and shopper. So there will already be within advertisers that side of the business, and there's this kind of like media brand type people. How do you see? And we're going to talk about it in lots of these other episodes. How is it on Tesco? Is it on the agency to kind of pull them together? I mean, it almost needs a bit of a restructure to get the most out of it.
Yeah, it's complex, and this was actually something that came up in the day that Vicky mentioned at OMG yesterday. I do think it starts with clients. We are all in some way, shape or form in service of clients, and we're already seeing in a number of instances clients making some strategic changes to their org design, to their org structure to pull shopper, e-com, media, and a whole bunch of other teams together to try and create more of a cohesive approach. And then I think we will follow suit. I think the thing that's incumbent upon us is to show the benefits of the work, the results when that actually happens. And so when we talk about how do we make that work, like how do we engage with planning communities, how do we engage with clients, being really specific and taking a very specific example, and there are examples, within both Wavemaker and within OMG, where we've been able to look holistically at the big problem that we're trying to solve. We call it like the exam question. How can retail media help to address some of those? And then how can Tesco help to work within that framework? That's where we get the best results. So trying to be specific leads to really good outcomes. If you try and present it as a theory or as a framework, I think sometimes that's where it falls down, because we get a lot of responses, which is like, well, what does that look like? So it'd be very easy to get the kind of the org chart up on a PowerPoint thing and go, okay, trade here, shopper here, we'll just put those together in some newfangled team and we'll kind of help you do that. Are you trying to mirror clients in that way as well, in the terms of how they're setting up to maybe help that conversation a bit more?
Yeah, I think so. I guess, part of our role is to look at how our teams are organised in line with kind of client businesses, but also we have our own structure in terms of, we are a matrix first organisation and focus on having that deep specialist skills that we can then bring together at the kind of right moment. But again, I think going at this idea of how do we elevate the conversation around retail media, bring it earlier, that's when the right conversations happen, early stages, to allow the right specialists to be kind of brought in to engage the right teams on a kind of client side as well. It
would be remiss of us if we didn't mention omnichannel or talk about full funnel. How much do you feel there is a perception that on some levels that retail media is this kind of bottom of the funnel, fairly transactional, probably going to target the people that are going to buy the tube of toothpaste anyway, versus it actually being something quite different, which can, build brand and do all of those things that we know it could?
I think there's probably sort of perceptual challenge, right, about where retail media sits, and obviously, as you say, historically, it's potentially been seen as that point of sale, conversion driving element. And as we've talked about, this, just the breadth of data that is available, the potential application of that becomes super interesting throughout an entire kind of purchase journey. So I think there's work to be done in terms of repositioning and showcasing the breadth that of impact it can have. But I think those conversations are kind of happening. I think, as Steve said, it's those case studies, it's those proof points that it works. It's telling those stories about the broader power of retail media and bringing the kind of conversation earlier.
Did you get a sense of that from your retail media day? And, this isn't just this bottom of the funnel thing. It can be much bigger.
Totally. And just picking up on that idea of the customer journey, and you think about that as whether you represent that as a funnel or however, overlaying that with something like an Ehrenberg Bass mental availability, physical availability, kind of sets quite a neat framework to understand where you can lever different parts of retail media and the data. So whether, some of it really effective at point of purchase in the physical availability, but equally when you're looking at audience understanding, in the priming phases, or, category entry points, and that's really in-depth understanding of shopper behaviour. That's the perfect place to bring in that data and those opportunities to right there. So I think it does play out across a much wider area of the funnel, as we call it.
We talked to Emma Foley, who of course looks after strategic planning at Tesco Media in episode 1. The breadth of data is quite incredible, the stuff that you can look at. How do you interrogate? I mean, there's just so many things you could ask. What's a sort of a really good brief? Does it go back to this exam question you were talking about? Give us a big meaty problem and we'll use all of this data to try and figure it out for you.
We focused quite heavily this year on trying to create a series of case studies or arguments that we could kind of take to the market. A lot of which have ended up in the Media Week, the new Media Week Retail Media Awards category. There's some for both OMG and Wavemaker, actually. And I think they do a good job of kind of helping to establish that. So some of those examples might be, you have a major toilet roll manufacturer and they have a major problem with people trading down in a time of, macroeconomic crisis, declining incomes, everything like that. And so the way in which that question would be phrased would be, well, how can we grow in a category that is declining? Or how can we encourage people to trade up to larger pack sizes because that's a more sustainable option for them? So like real issues. And then we can start to take a look within those kind of frameworks. We can start to take a look at, well, why are people doing that? What other behaviors do we see that show that that's happening? And then how do we use that information to chart a path to try and arrest that decline or to create new value propositions? And what you end up with, and there's a number of examples of these, is you end up with these quite detailed strategies which focus on delivering very specific messages with very specific value propositions, sometimes with different kind of like branding and imagery and all that kind of business, that are delivered to audiences that demonstrate very specific behaviors. And it all sounds quite straightforward, right? But what you're then doing is you're creating this enormous test and learn environment where you're constantly toggling and learning and dialing up and dialing down and testing messages to see what really lands. And then if you wrap that in a measurement framework, where obviously, based on what we can see, we can start to talk about, well, actually, how have you increased share in the category? How have you been able to encourage that trading up behavior, as well as other measurement frameworks, whether it's econometric modeling or MMMs or whatever it may well be. You can start to really think about how retail media can address real business challenges. And I think we need to collectively as an industry do more to showcase that kind of work and those kind of use cases. But it's happening now.
That's what I find really interesting working with the specialists about bringing in sort of classic planning language and approaches into their world and it sort of making that bridge. So something like growth mapping, which is what we would do as a norm as part of our planning process, and explaining how, unpacking that for the commerce specialists, what does growth mapping look like? How do you and go through this, X number of ways you can grow a brand, and getting them to think, that language works and it resonates then with the wider planning community. Sort of making those connections, I think, is really going to be helpful to get sort of that wider understanding of really getting both teams on the same page.
Yeah, sometimes internally we often talk about our roles, like my team's role in the business in agency development, as translators, trying to be able to connect retail and retailer language with planning communities who are often focused or often kind of talk about the opportunity or the challenge in different ways. And so one of the things that Emma and her team do focus on quite a lot is, based on what we can see, what are the sources of growth? Like, what does that look like? And then we'll work with the planning community to align on putting that into a plan, an operating model. And I think there's more that we can do there. It still feels like we're at the early stages of that kind of process, but we're already starting to see some good results.
Can I touch back on measurement, which you talked about there? And you mentioned you mentioned MMN, you mentioned econometrics. There's this kind of prevailing view that ROAS is not the answer when it comes to retail media. Help me understand why that might not be the case, or why that's quite a limited view to have.
I heard somebody yesterday say ROAS drug. It kind of feels, I've been in the industry a while. We probably had this conversation way back, James, about mobile and everything like that. And I know that the IAB have for a long time been talking about getting past click-through rates. So I think every sort of media channel, every emerging area has its challenge with establishing its long-term value proposition, because if you can measure it, people often ask you to measure it. Yeah. And I think the thing that we have to be conscious of is ROAS is important. Everyone's trying to sell something. Everyone's trying to be effective in how they do that. However, the definitions of that are very different depending upon the nature of the product you're trying to sell. And I think our challenge with ROAS is you often discount a lot of really good mid and long term kind of behavior change, right? Especially when you're talking about, like I was saying before, categories that are in decline or brands that are in decline in a category. You don't just change that in a month campaign, even if that's really even if the campaign is great and the creative really works in that environment, that just doesn't change overnight. And if it does, then it might, regress after that campaign. And so we're focused on a number of different areas, such as how we bring in new customers into the category, how we bring in new customers in to engage with that brand, and then how we continue to evolve that relationship over time. So like lifetime value, survival curves, all of those kind of things. I do think it's incumbent upon us to say, if not ROAS, then what?
Yes, definitely.
And I think as an industry, that's probably something that we want to look at, creating new currencies or new kind of measurement standards. And measurement is probably the single biggest focus area in our business at the minute, because we know that there are probably more questions than answers. And I think working really closely with our agency partners will help us to come up with a number of those answers.
Well, that teases up very nicely for Wishlist Time, where you guys get to tell Steve exactly what you do on. So measurements off the table. We've talked about that. What is on your retail media wish list, Andy? Is there something that you really want, or maybe you don't want? I mean, we hear a lot about no more walled gardens, please. We've got plenty of those. It'd be nice if you all kind of worked together and we had a kind of a common language. But wish list, and Steve sat just a few meters away. He'd be squirreling these things down, I'm sure, to take away.
Suddenly feels like it got
got a bit interrogation.
The spotlight comes down. I think for me the interesting thing is how we look to grow non-endemic brands in this space. And I think the thing that unlocks that, we talked about the other day, is the powerful insight that you're kind of sat on and really getting deep into that. Because it's real human behavior. It's not just surveyed responding, saying, yes, I would have bought that thing. Like, it's genuine purchasing behavior. And that in itself is super powerful. But thinking about how we explode that out of the kind of the obvious brands that we're already kind of working on and think at that broader kind of category level, that to me feels like the unlocker that's going to allow us to elevate the conversation again.
What would you love to have, Vicky?
I think we need to make sure that practical answer. Firstly, that standards, because when they're bringing all of the retail media partners together, making sure that when we worked with ISBAR last year on retail media standards, so that to make sure that that's the transparency and the validation of all of that's really important, so that everyone's kind of understanding everything is equal. So, but once we sort of move beyond that, the ambition is to get those data sets with context, and that's the important thing for me. It's always understanding why. So what drove that, and the data behind that. And I think that we're just starting on that journey, and bringing that real insight into our plans is going to be so powerful.
Yeah. Is there anything on your wish list in terms of, as the industry, you kind of want us to do? Like, retail media is going to grow. If you look at any prediction, it's going to grow. But I wonder if there's some levers or some accelerators. I mean, standards feels like if you get everyone calling apples apples and pears pears, that's an accelerator for growth. But anything on your wish list?
I mean, sort of one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, I guess. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and this is part of an evolution, we talk about coming of age, right? I think we had that conversation at IAB Upfronts last year. Yeah. I would argue that retail media in its current form is still in its adolescence. It's moved into the kind of teenage years, maybe. Coming with all the kind of good stuff and all the chaos that comes with that. I have a number of teenage children, so I can
unpack it.
Maybe make a different podcast about that. And I think we've done a good job as an industry of setting some parameters around standards. But I still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done as an industry of building on top of that. An example might be actually the way in which we calculate a conversion is different from one retailer to another. I mean, this obviously will happen because as any channel matures, it evolves in that way to kind of create common standards, common language that helps it to scale. I think the big ask from me, and I guess this is mainly pointed towards my sort of customers in agencies, is we're asking for a greater degree of inquisitiveness and curiosity from a wider community. And I recognize, particularly with planning teams, everybody's probably doing like 3 jobs at the minute. Everyone's barely getting through the day, getting through the to-do list. It's easy for me to say this, but I would love it if we were posed more genuinely kind of critical questions by the wider planning community. That might be for non-endemics, it might be for endemics, but thinking about how we can help solve problems based on the fact that we're sat on, Club Card community of 22 million, and we've been thinking about how to utilize that for many years now. There's a lot that we can tell you about kind of audiences, but sometimes it starts with the right question. I think that's what we would ask for, probably more than anything else. It sounds very simplistic, but I think that creates a culture of collaboration. So it's a little bit like sort the foundations out, but then also make sure that the sky. Exactly. And it's a little bit stalactite, right? But maybe I got a bit greedy there, James.
No, I think it's a really thing, and maybe you kind of want planners, strategists to have this curious gene within you.
I'm careful what I wish
well done. You've got it.
I was going to add one other thing. I think we as an industry are really guilty of particularly digital advertising, not thinking about the consumer. And given where we talked about the retail media relatively in its infancy growing, I think as an industry we have the opportunity to put that consumer lens on the development of the offering, so that it is not interruptive and a burden on the user and a terrible user experience like a lot of the digital advertising world has become. And I think there are some decisions, I guess, as an industry, as various bodies we can make in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years that should be about putting the consumer first, so that the experience is additive and beneficial and not interruptive and quite frankly painful. We all know a lot of digital advertising can be.
I think I do think that's a really, really important point. I've seen this over a number of years. I think that the difference when you're talking about a retail environment, just talking about like on-site, in-store, for the moment here, is if you don't think about the customer first, like that's your core proposition, right? Everything else follows from that, and we're very customer first business. To that end, like one of the things that is a really tiny but really important dynamic is if you're running a campaign for a client and that product isn't in stock in that particular store, that's like the worst customer experience. So there are some very specific practicalities to think about, but then it also does, I mean, that's part of our kind of product development cycle. We're constantly thinking about, well, how is a customer going to react to this? Is this additive to their experience or is it interruptive? And you can't do that in a retail environment.
And I think you've got this, retailers have this examination of all of those things, because you're not a business that just makes 100% of your revenue from advertising. You will think about the customer, because if we get the customer experience wrong, that customer's going to go and shop at another supermarket. And I think there's that kind of always that sort of handbrake being pulled slightly on. Now, that might mean you innovate slower, or the sort of the move fast and break thing isn't there. But I think from a consumer point of view, I mean, you couldn't really ask to work with a bunch of better businesses who are just obsessed about the consumer and what you do, whether it's in store or online. So I think from a lovely sort of helicopter, nice IAB standpoint, thinking about the user is great. And wouldn't it be great if some businesses came along and became media owners who are obsessed with the customer? Well, guess what? They're retailers, and that's what they're doing. Immense. Thank you so much for giving us some time. Thank you, Andy, Vicky. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And that's a wrap on our retail media mini-series with Tesco Media and Insight Platform. Huge thanks to Steve, Vicky and Andy for joining me today and sharing their insights. Hopefully you're feeling as inspired as I am about the future of retail media. And don't forget, as part of the IAB's Retail Media Upfronts, which are just around the corner on Wednesday the 22nd of October, you can hear from Tesco alongside some of the other biggest names in retail. If you want to find out more about how retail media can transform your brand strategy, make sure you're there. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon for another episode of the IAB UK podcast.
IAB UK, building a better future for digital advertising for the benefit of everyone.